Have you ever like really thought about all the crazy energy just like surrounding us, like right here, even in the air we breathe?
It's kind of mind-blowing when you stop and consider it.
It's almost science fiction-y, you know? But what if we could actually use that energy? Like, what if we could tap into that energy almost like, well, kind of like how our own cells do,
I see where you're going with this.
with those like internal power plants, mitochondria,
Right, mitochondria, yeah.
constantly generating energy so efficiently. I mean, that's what we're diving into today, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We're going deep on this whole idea of, well, harvesting energy straight from the atmosphere.
Straight from the air. Wild.
It is pretty wild. A constant, everywhere energy source.
Just imagine. Available everywhere, all the time.
It's a pretty profound concept when you think about it. I mean, it makes you think about, well, like those electrical charges you sometimes see around trees.
Oh, yeah, especially during storms.
Yeah, exactly. Or even, taking it down to the microscopic level, how mitochondria in our cells actually make power.
It's all about energy at every scale.
Energy is fundamental.
So for this deep dive, we've got some seriously detailed research on this.
Oh, yeah, we dug deep for this one.
Some of it's about these futuristic, like bio-inspired rotors
Those are pretty cool.
designed to like copy how cells work. It's pretty amazing.
Biomimicry, it's a powerful approach.
Totally. And then there are other ideas that are about like more directly capturing that electrical charge that's already in the air all around us.
Yeah, just grabbing it right out of the atmosphere.
So our mission today is to, well, really unpack how these systems are supposed to actually work.
We're going to get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah. And like what their potential could really be, you know?
Because if it works, it could be huge.
It could like totally change the energy game.
Oh, yeah, totally.
All right, so let's get into this. The first thing that I thought was really cool was this idea of a bio-inspired rotor, you know?
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept.
So they're thinking, if our mitochondria can spin this tiny little machine,
ATP synthase.
ATP synthase, right? If they can spin that using charge gradients, and they call that the proton motive force.
It's like a tiny biological motor.
Right. So could we like scale that up? Could we do something similar, but like way bigger using the Earth's natural charge, between the Earth and the atmosphere?
Use the planet as a battery, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. That natural electrical difference. That's the core idea here, to basically copy how our cells constantly make energy, but do it at a much larger scale with atmospheric charge. I mean, it's pretty revolutionary.
It really is a bold idea, and what's fascinating is how they're directly linking it to a fundamental biological process.
Oh, yeah, it's all about that biomimicry.
The concept, as it's laid out, is basically harnessing the natural electrical potential difference between, well, you have the positively charged ionosphere way up in the atmosphere.
Okay, the ionosphere.
And then the negatively charged Earth's surface.
The ground.
Yeah, the ground,
Oh, yeah.
exactly. They want to use that to make this artificial rotor spin.
So it's like a natural battery.
Yeah, exactly. A natural battery with a built-in voltage difference.
Okay, so they're talking about making something called an electron transport layer,
Right. They call it the ETL.
the ETL. And it would have to be made from some pretty wild materials, right?
Yeah, some pretty high-tech stuff.
Like graphene, that superconductive single atom layer of carbon.
Graphene's amazing.
And then also ion-selective polymers, which I guess that means they only let certain charged particles through.
It's like a filter for ion.
So this layer, this ETL, would basically move those electrons around while also keeping the positive and negative charges separate.
Exactly. It's very similar to how membranes work within a mitochondrion,
Oh, yeah. Maintaining that separation.
Creating that gradient.
Okay, that's cool.
Mm.
But to actually grab those free electrons from the air, they're talking about using these nano-spiked collectors.
Yeah, these are pretty wild.
It's like, you ever look at a pine tree needle?
Uh-huh.
Or like how lightning branches out? It's kind of like that, right?
It is, yeah. Fractal patterns, that's what they call them.
So the idea is that these super tiny structures would have a ton of surface area. So they'd be really good at picking up that electrical charge that's just floating around in the atmosphere.
It's all about maximizing the surface area.
So basically you build up this electrical difference with the ETL and the nanocollectors.
You're storing that potential energy.
And then this is the really crazy part. They wanted to use that to like physically spin a rotor.
Convert that electrical potential into mechanical energy.
So the movement of those ions being pulled by that electric field, that would directly turn into like spinning energy.
It's a direct conversion.
And get this, they want to take the biomimicry even further.
Oh, how so?
They're thinking about making the design of these collectors and storage elements even more efficient by looking at like the shapes of trees and leaves.
Taking cues from nature.
Yeah, like those spiked shapes with all that surface area, that's supposed to be the best way to pull in charge from the air.
Nature has already optimized these shapes over millions of years.
Exactly. And then, you know how leaves have those membrane structures?
Yeah, the veins and structures within the leaves.
Do you think we could use something like that to keep those charges separate? Just like what happens in the compartments inside mitochondria.
It all comes back to the mitochondrial analogy.
So with this initial rotor design, they were saying it had all these advantages over like regular renewable energy.
Better than solar panels or wind turbines.
Yeah. At first they were saying no moving parts, which, well, we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
But the big things were supposed to be that it could run 24/7.
Because that atmospheric charge is always there.
Right. And they also said it would be super efficient, like down at the molecular level.
Like our cells.
Just like our cells.
That's some pretty bold claims.
They were. And they even had some pretty specific ideas about how big these things would be,
So like blueprints.
Yeah. They were thinking the rotor itself might weigh something like 5 to 10 kilos.
5 to 10 kilos, okay.
And the whole system, maybe 50 to 100 kilos.
Okay, so not huge.
No, and about 3 to 10 meters tall, depending on how much power you wanted.
Interesting. And what about the cost? Were they thinking this would be affordable?
Yeah, they actually gave some numbers.
So like real world projections.
Yeah, for like a home unit, to power a single house, maybe around $3,000.
$3,000, that's not bad.
And it could generate like 5 to 10 kilowatt hours per day.
Not bad at all.
And they said it'd be super low maintenance and easy to fix if something went wrong.
Sounds pretty user-friendly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. As with anything, when you're trying to, copy nature, things get complicated.
Nature's complex.
Yeah. You remember how we were talking about how mitochondria make energy?
Yeah, with the proton gradient.
It's not just like electrons flowing and spinning a wheel, right?
It's more nuanced than that.
It's way more nuanced. So, inside mitochondria, the energy molecule, ATP, that gets made by this electrochemical gradient. It's a gradient of protons, those positively charged hydrogen ions, across the membrane.
It's like a tiny battery within the cell.
Right. And there are these molecules like CoQ10 and NAD plus eyeball.
Those are key players in the electron transport chain.
Right, the electron transport chain. And they're crucial for pumping those protons across the membrane to make that gradient, that proton motive force.
So it's not just electrons flowing freely.
No, it's way more directed.
You have to have that separation, that gradient.
That gradient. So the initial idea of the rotor, it was mostly about just electron flow making it spin.
It oversimplified things a bit.
It did, yeah. It missed some of those important details about how ATP synthase really works.
It's like the proton motive force.
Okay.
Yeah. So the key difference here is that while electrons can move pretty freely in conductive materials, in a biological system, you have this very specific directed movement of protons. And that's what creates the potential difference, that proton motive force that drives the energy conversion.
So basically, they needed to make the rotor design more like how our cells actually do it.
More biologically accurate.
So they came up with some tweaks and modifications.
Trying to get closer to that biological model.
So one of the big changes was adding this, what they called an ion transport layer.
Oh, so like a dedicated channel for ions.
Yeah. It was supposed to work kind of like the space between the membranes in a mitochondrion.
Yeah, so controlling the buildup and flow of charged ions.
Exactly. And then instead of just a straight flow of charge, they thought about having this 2-layer charge storage system.
A high charge reservoir and a low charge sink.
Right, a high and a low. It's like they were trying to build up that pressure difference, that potential energy, how there's a higher concentration of protons on one side of the mitochondrial membrane.
Creating that gradient artificially.
So they wanted to control how those ions moved between those high and low charge areas.
And how do they propose to do that?
They were talking about using voltage-controlled ion flow.
So little gates that only open at a certain voltage.
Yeah. Kind of like how protons only go through ATP synthase when there's enough of a difference in concentration.
It's all about controlling that flow.
And then they changed how they were going to actually spin the rotor too, right?
So not a direct electrical push anymore.
They started looking into this thing called a rotational discharge mechanism.
Sounds fancy.
It was pretty complex. So they would have this ring of electrodes all arranged in a circle.
Okay.
And then they would release those built-up charges in these super precise pulses.
Pulses of charge.
Yeah. And those pulses would create a rotating magnetic field.
A rotating magnetic field.
The rotor would have magnets in it.
Yeah.
And it would spin without actually being physically touched by anything.
It's like magnetic levitation, but for rotation.
Yeah, it's kind of like that.
So they went from a direct push to a more indirect magnetic spin.
Well, to make it more like ATP synthase,
Trying to stick to the biological model.
But here's what I was thinking. There's got to be other ways to get this energy, right?
Other than just this bio-inspired rotor.
Yeah.
Well, you're in luck because the research we looked at actually talked about 3 main ways to do this atmospheric charge energy harvesting.
3 different methods. Cool.
Yeah, 3 different approaches. The first one, as we've been talking about, is the rotor-based method.
Even with all those fancy refinements.
Even with all the biomimicry, yeah.
But even though they're trying to make it spin continuously, it still involves, mechanical movement.
It's still a physical system.
Which means you've got things like friction, wear and tear.
And potential points of failure.
And they were saying the efficiency might only be 1 to 3%.
1 to 3%. That's not great.
Not great. Plus, even though they're using magnets now, there are still moving parts.
Right. So it's not completely a no moving parts system anymore.
So the second method is totally different. It's called the direct capacitor charge differential method.
No moving parts at all with that one.
None. It's all about using that atmospheric charge to create a voltage difference across like a capacitor.
So directly storing the energy.
Yeah. And that sounded way simpler,
Mechanically, yeah, much simpler.
And they were saying it could be more efficient too, maybe 5 to 7%.
That's a significant jump.
And because there are no moving parts, it should last longer and need less maintenance.
So more reliable and less hassle.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing there are downsides to this approach too, right?
There were a few, yeah. Like they said it might not be as good at handling changes in, how much charge is in the air.
So less adaptable to fluctuations.
And it could also lose charge over time, like a leaky battery.
So storage could be an issue.
And there might be limits to how much power it could put out at any given time.
So not as good for, sudden bursts of energy demand.
But then there's the third method. And this one sounded like the most, advanced.
Even more advanced than the bio-inspired rotor.
I think so, yeah. It's called the voltage gradient flow system.
Or voltage gradient flow system.
Yeah. And it's all about, directly using that natural voltage difference between the Earth and the ionosphere.
Just tapping right into that natural potential.
And get this, they think it could be 8 to 10% efficient.
8 to 10%. That's really impressive.
Right. And it would have no moving parts, super low maintenance, just like the capacitor one.
So the benefits are similar to the capacitor method.
But even better efficiency.
But of course, there's a catch, right?
Yeah, there's always a catch.
Yeah.
So for this one, you need some really, really specific materials.
Super high-tech stuff.
And they have to be engineered at, the nanoscale.
That's tiny.
It's crazy tiny. And it could be sensitive to the environment, like temperature and stuff.
So less robust, potentially.
And, making something that complicated on a large scale is going to be tough.
The engineering challenges are significant.
But still, when you compare how efficient all 3 methods are supposed to be, the voltage gradient flow system seems like it has the most potential.
From a purely theoretical perspective, it's the clear winner.
Yeah.
All right, so let's dive into that voltage gradient flow system a little deeper. You were talking about how it uses the natural voltage gradient.
Yeah.
Can you break down how that actually works?
So it's basically all about the fact that the Earth's surface is negatively charged.
Okay.
And then way up high, the ionosphere, that layer of charged particles, is positive.
So it's like a giant natural capacitor.
Exactly. And that creates this voltage difference in the atmosphere. On average, it's around 100 to 300 volts for every meter you go up.
That's a pretty significant potential difference.
Especially when the weather's good.
Right, fair weather conditions.
And this is happening all the time, continuously.
So it's a constant source of energy.
So they want to build a system that can tap into that.
Makes sense.
And the way they're talking about doing that is with something they call quantum-enhanced charge separation.
That sounds pretty high-tech.
It is.
Quantum mechanics involved.
Yeah. So they want to use these super thin layers of materials, like just a few atoms thick.
Atomically thin layers, wow.
Along with graphene and these really precisely engineered surfaces at the nanoscale.
It's all about controlling those charges at the atomic level.
Right. And the idea is to make it so charge can be separated and moved around super efficiently.
Minimal resistance, maximum efficiency.
Exactly. And they're even talking about using quantum tunneling.
Quantum tunneling.
To move charge across those tiny barriers.
That's getting into some serious physics.
It is. But it could mean even faster charge transfer.
So how would this system actually work in practice, like step by step?
Okay, so they're thinking about a multi-layered structure.
Multiple layers of these special materials.
Yeah, like a stack of super thin films, each one designed to do something specific.
So each layer has a particular function.
So the top layer would be all about collecting that high potential charge from the atmosphere.
Okay.
And then the middle layers would separate and concentrate those charges.
But they don't just recombine.
And then the bottom layer would neutralize the charges and let you actually use the energy.
So a three-step process. Collection, separation, extraction.
And to build this, they're talking about using some pretty wild materials.
Yeah, what kind of materials are we talking about here?
So for the conductors, they're thinking graphene-enhanced polymers.
Graphene keeps coming up.
It's super conductive, right? And then for the separation layers, they're looking at nanostructured graphene and also ion-selective polymers.
To control which ions can pass through.
And even like quantum dots.
Quantum dots, what are those?
They're these tiny semiconductor crystals, and they have like quantum properties.
Interesting.
They think they could make charge separation even more efficient.
So it's like a supercharged separation layer.
And physically, these units would be pretty tall, like 10 to 30 meters.
10 to 30 meters, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they want to maximize the surface area, so they're thinking about using those fractal patterns again, like with the rotor,
So like a really intricate branched structure.
to catch as much charge as possible.
So how does it actually work, the whole process?
So first, those nanospikes collect the charge.
Okay.
And that might even involve quantum tunneling, like we were talking about.
To make it even more efficient.
Then the charge concentration system kicks in,
Yeah.
and the different layers with their different electrical properties, they work together to like pack those charges together without losing any energy.
So it's like a charge pump
And then finally, that concentrated charge gets turned into usable electricity,
and stored in capacitors.
probably in capacitors, yeah. And the whole thing happens without any moving parts.
So very little energy loss in the conversion process.
And they think a small unit, like for a house, could make 10 to 20 kilowatt hours a day.
10 to 20 kilowatt hours, not bad.
A medium one, maybe 50 to 100.
Okay, that's starting to get more serious.
And a large one, maybe even over 200.
200 kilowatt hours, that's a lot of power.
And it would be running all the time, day and night.
Completely independent of weather conditions.
Yeah. They're estimating the materials would cost somewhere between $1,000 and $7,000,
1 to 7,000, okay.
depending on how big and complex it is.
And what about the retail price for consumers?
They think it could be anywhere from $5,000 to $25,000.
5 to 25,000.
And because there are no moving parts, it should last for 10 to 15 years without needing any maintenance.
10 to 15 years, that's impressive.
But the big challenge is scaling it up, you know?
Mass producing those complex nanomaterials.
Exactly. But this system has some really cool features, like that quantum tunneling thing we were talking about.
Yeah, that's pretty groundbreaking.
And the nano-engineered surfaces, and the fact that it's just directly converting that natural voltage difference.
It's so elegant, in theory.
And it's always on, always harvesting energy.
That's a huge advantage.
Okay, so remember how we were talking about that improved version of the bio-inspired rotor?
The one that was supposed to be more like a mitochondrion?
They really wanted to make it work like those proton gradients, you know?
Using controlled charge buildup and those nanoscale charge gates?
So it's still about collecting electrons, but then they wanted to build up specific ion concentrations.
Like a real proton gradient.
Yeah. And they had this two-membrane system to create a high charge area and a low charge area.
So the ions would flow from high to low, just like in a cell.
And that flow would drive the rotor, but still using that pulsed magnetic field.
So still no direct contact.
The overall size and power output would be about the same as the first rotor design.
And the cost projections, too.
Yeah, about the same.
But with the added benefit of that ion transport layer for more efficient charge dynamics.
And still 24/7 operation.
So a more refined, biologically inspired approach.
But let's get into the specifics, like step by step. How does this thing actually make electricity?
Okay, let's break it down. Step 1. You got to harvest that atmospheric charge.
Got to get those electrons.
So they use these fractal nanospike collectors made from like carbon nanotubes and graphene polymers.
So they're grabbing those charges right out of the air.
And they're estimating that they can collect somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5 microamps per square centimeter of that collector surface.
It doesn't sound like much.
It's not a huge amount of current, but remember the atmosphere is vast. There's a lot of surface area to work with.
So what happens next?
Step 2. the charge separation layer. This is where it gets really interesting.
So this is where the biomimicry really comes in.
Exactly. So you have these two membrane layers with a special ion transport layer sandwiched in between.
Like the membranes in a mitochondria.
And within these layers, you have these nano-engineered ion-selective polymers.
To filter the ions.
Exactly. They only allow certain ions to pass through, blocking others. And then you have these graphene-based charge gates that control the flow of electrons.
So it's like a super sophisticated filtering system.
It really is. And all of this is designed to mimic how the electron transport chain works in mitochondria.
To create that gradient.
Exactly. Concentrating the energy and building up that potential difference across the membrane, just like the proton motive force.
Okay, so we've gone from capturing those charges to concentrating them. Now how do we get the rotor spinning?
Step 3. Rotational energy conversion. This is where that pulsed discharge mechanism comes into play.
So they're using those timed pulses of charge again.
Yeah, so you have this ring of electromagnetic electrodes around the rotor.
Okay.
And they release those concentrated charges in these precisely timed bursts.
Like a controlled explosion of energy.
And that creates a rotating magnetic field.
So it spins the rotor without touching it.
And that rotor, it's likely made from or incorporates magnetic materials, so it responds to those changes in the magnetic field and starts spinning.
Pretty clever. But the efficiency of this conversion from electrical to mechanical energy is only 1 to 3%.
Yeah, that's still a limitation.
So they have a lot of work to do to improve that.
But the argument is that the abundance of atmospheric charge could offset that low efficiency.
Yeah, if you have enough of the source, even a small percentage can be significant.
Absolutely. And then finally, step 4, energy storage and distribution.
So taking that spinning energy and making it useful.
Right. So they would use a generator to convert that mechanical rotation into electricity.
Standard generator technology.
And then
All right.
that electricity can be stored in batteries or capacitors for later use, or potentially even fed back into the grid.
So it could be used to power homes or even contribute to the larger energy system.
Exactly. And the power output, it would depend on the size of the unit, but even a small one could potentially power a house.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So we've got this system that can harvest energy from the atmosphere continuously, 24/7.
It's a pretty compelling idea.
But there's still some big challenges, right?
There are. The efficiency of that rotational conversion needs to be improved.
And the materials are complex and expensive to make.
And it's all very theoretical at this point. We need to see real-world implementations to prove it can actually work as advertised.
So lots of work to do.
Yeah.
But the potential is huge.
It really is. I mean, imagine a world where we can harness this abundant, clean energy source that's all around us.
It would be a game changer.
A truly sustainable energy future.
So to wrap things up, we've looked at two main approaches to harvesting atmospheric energy.
The bio-inspired rotor and the voltage gradient flow system.
And while both are super interesting, the voltage gradient flow system seems to have the edge in terms of efficiency.
At least in theory.
And it makes you think, with all the advances in nanotechnology, could this be the future of energy?
It's a tantalizing possibility.
A future where energy is everywhere, all the time, just like it is inside our own cells.
It's a thought-provoking idea, and we encourage all of you listening to dig deeper into this.
Yeah, do some research on nanomaterials, bio-inspired design, atmospheric electricity. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of atmospheric energy harvesting. It's been a wild ride.
It has. Until next time.
See you next time.